In this installment, we'll perform the weighted average calculation. Recall that we did the straight average calculation in a prior video, and following the same strategy, we're going to do the weighted average for the first row of our spreadsheet, standard operating procedure when it comes to spreadsheets. We'll use the first row of data to calculate our example entry, and then we'll apply it to the subsequent rows in the spreadsheet. So we have the homework, quiz, and midterm and final data for Bob. And the weighted average calculation, we'll be putting that in this cell right here, M6 in my case, column M, row 6. I had provided a handy dandy little reference in the project area for this site. You have a sample finished project, and at the bottom of that sheet, and this is demarcated for reference only. Certainly when you hand in your version of this, don't add the for reference only stuff. That's just for your edification. But you'll note that under the formula examples that I provided, I have a formula for weighted average here, weighted average for column M6. Well, let's talk a little bit about rubrics, because this really kind of hangs off of that concept. So if you look at my rubrics table here, I've got 3 items, homework, quizzes, and exams, and I'd like to apply a scaling and a weighting factor to each one of these. Now, weights are probably more familiar to you. The first question you get from students usually is, how much do homeworks, quizzes, and exams count towards the grade? So in my hypothetical course, homework submissions are 25% of your grade, quizzes are 40% of the grade, and exams will be 35% of the grade. Methods to my madness here. Well, homeworks tend to be more formative types of assessments. We talked about those earlier, but those are assessing students' learning and giving them feedback on what they don't know so that they can improve upon their performance. Quizzes and exams tend to be more summative, and by that we mean they kind of sum up the state of a student's understanding. Unfortunately, in the era of high stakes testing, exams really kind of have a punitive aspect to them. They talk about high stakes testing as though your life depends upon the outcome of a test. But this is the way schools work currently, so we have to live with that. Now remember that the homeworks are graded on a scale of 0 to 5. So we can have a lot of homework, but the scale is very coarse, so it's easy to grade. Quizzes are scored on a 0 to 10 scale, so there's a little bit finer granularity there, so we can make distinctions, but still the student's grade doesn't hang upon it necessarily. And then finally we have exams, which are the high stakes elements, which are very fine grained, 0 to 100 scale. So the thing we need to do, however, is you want to normalize all your scores to 100 points. So for example, if the highest score you can get on a homework is a 5, well, to normalize that to a 100-point scale, you'd have to multiply the student's score by 20. So for example, if they get a 5, 5 times 20 is 100. Quizzes being on a 10-point scale, well, if you get a 10 out of 10, that translates over to 100. The exams are already normalized on a 100-point scale. They're graded on a 0 to 100 scale. So we actually have to apply a factor to each one of these when we compute the average. We have to weigh them by the percentage, and we also have to weigh them by a scaling factor that will bump them up to 100 if they're not already on a 100-point scale. So I've given you the formula in the formula examples area, and you can go take a look at that. But what I'm going to do is, let me get this out of your way. Let's go back to our spreadsheet and kind of develop the logic of this in real time. So here I am in column M, row 6. I want to calculate Bob's weighted average. Well, what I need to do is get the component averages for homeworks, quizzes, and exams. So this kind of makes sense if you follow along with me and catch my drift. I'm going to enter an equal sign first of all in that cell to indicate that I'm entering a formula and not a text or a numeric entry. So equals is the way you signal to a spreadsheet that you're going to enter a formula. And I want to do the average calculation of, which is how we read the left parenthesis. Then I'm going to click and drag this time just on the homeworks. So I put a marquee around just the homeworks for Bob, close parenthesis. Now that would give me the average of the homeworks. Well, I want to add to that, so I'm going to hit the plus sign. I want the average of, left parentheses, quizzes 1 through 3. So I'm clicking and dragging. And note nicely enough, these are color coded, so you can kind of match them up by color. Green is homeworks and red is quizzes. Close parentheses. So we have the average of the homeworks plus the average of the quizzes plus the average of the midterm and the final. So again, I'm clicking and dragging across the midterm and the final, close parentheses. Now, we have the average of the homeworks plus the average of the quizzes plus the average of the exams. Let me hit enter. And well, this isn't quite accurate yet, but it's an intermediate calculation. And let's go to the address bar now and take a look at what we've got here. Well, remember that the average of the homeworks, remember the homeworks don't count as 100% of the grade. They're a fraction of the grade. So what we need to do is apply our weighting factor. Let's take another look at our handy dandy little reference here from the worked out example. Recall that homeworks are 25% of the grade, quizzes are 40% of the grade, and exams are 35%. Now I'm going to put this on my other screen, but keep it handy for reference. And by the way, recall that the weights all have to add up to 100, right? So let's put this scaling factor in here. Just before the average calculation, I'm going to type in 25% of, remember we use an asterisk for multiplication on computers. So that gives us 25% the average of the homeworks plus, referring to my handy dandy little reference, 40% of, and whenever you type multiplication again, you read that as of, 40% the average of the quizzes, plus 35% of the average of the midterm and the final. Now there's one other thing that we need to do here. Not only do we want 25% of the homeworks, 40% of the quizzes, and 35% of the average of the exams, but we also have to apply our scaling factor. The homeworks are graded on a 0 to 5 scale, so I'm going to have to multiply that measure by 20 to scale it up to 100. And I'm also going to have to multiply the quizzes by 10 to scale them up to 100 points. Let's then hit enter, and voila, now we have an accurate measure, an accurate weighted average calculation. Again, for review, the weighted average is equal to 25% times the average of the homeworks times 20 to bump it up to 100, plus 40% the average of the quizzes times 10 to scale it up to a 100-point scale, plus 35% the average of the midterm and the final. J6 is the midterm, K6 is the final. So there we have our normalized weighted average calculation. Last but not least, we'll click on our grab box and drag down that calculation to apply it to the other 3 rows. Now, one final point here, and this is a point of style, I want to click and drag across all the numbers in this range. Note that I've got an absurd number of decimal points here in the second calculation. What we want to do is round everything off, and in order to do that, there's a speed button. The 1, 2, 3 speed button is the formatting button, and I'm going to adjust this to a rounded decimal entry. So let's just click on that and note that all of the numbers in this range are rounded to the ones place. So final point of formatting there. Next, we'll move on to the grade calculation. We need to translate the numeric scores, the numeric weighted averages, into letter grades.